morning, everyone. Welcome to the Social Innovation Conference, SICON 2020, brought to you by the Social Outcomes Lab and supported by ACT Government and the Australian National University. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today in the last day of the SICON series for now. My name is Nazia Ahmed. I am the director and founder of the Social Outcomes Lab, and I'm so excited to be talking to Andrew Mehrton, who is the executive branch manager in ACT Government of the social policy area. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Nazia. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I can't wait to get into conversation with you, but just before we get started, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to start by recognizing the Darug people as the traditional owners of the land where I'm conducting this webinar from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land from where Andrew is joining the webinar from today. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands where our viewers are joining in from today as well. I'd also like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize that Aboriginal people have a really rich history and culture and wisdom from all of us to learn from. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that Aboriginal people have faced and currently face a lot of pain, trauma, and that the social outcomes for Aboriginal people are still much lower than that of the rest of the population, and a commitment for all of us to work together to ensure that those gaps are minimized and that we all have a really fantastic future together. On that note, welcome, Andrew. How are you again?
I'm good. Very excited. Thank you.
I'm very excited too. We have so much to talk about today, and our topic, of course, is social innovation in Canberra, and particularly the role of public policy. So we're so incredibly lucky to have you as our guest today. So before I hand over to you to tell us more about what you do and yourself, I'm just going to share your role. So Andrew is a senior executive in ACT Government's Chief Minister, Treasury and Economic Development Directorate, and he advises the government on social policy matters. Andrew, you're a long-serving member of the ACT Public Service with experience across a range of economic, social, and environmental issues, including work on innovation policy in the ACT as part of the government's business development strategies, and more recently, social reforms such as reducing harms associated with drug use and making Canberra a more welcoming and inclusive city for LGBTQI+ people. It's pretty phenomenal, Andrew. So tell me about yourself as a social change maker. SICON is obviously, it's about celebrating social innovations, but it's very much also about celebrating the person behind it. So tell me in your words, sort of, what made you decide to go on the pathway of working in the social policy space, and what's been your sort of journey, and just tell us about yourself in general.
Sure, happy to. So look, I've been living in Canberra for about half of my life. I moved here from Newcastle to finish school and went on to university. I basically fell in love with the city after we moved here for my family's work, so I've stuck around and studied at UC before going into the ACT Public Service, where I've been for a bit over a decade now. So I was really drawn to government, I guess, because I wanted to make a positive change in the community, as many of the audience today will have as well. The ACT government in particular appealed to me because I guess it has a bit more of a local connection compared to the federal government, which is obviously another big player in town. And I started in what was the Territory Municipal Services Department at the time, working on kind of small P policy around government real estate, but that gave me an opportunity to work in areas like climate change and energy efficiency, looking at how the government could reduce its carbon emissions. And the great thing about being in the ACT government was that I kind of just naturally got the opportunity to move through a number of different roles and departments and try different things. So I moved on from working on real estate policy into energy efficiency, and then moved into working on housing affordability programs and policies for a number of years, which was just really excellent and fascinating work to be able to do. And then from there moved into, as you mentioned in the intro, economic policy and business development, where we got to really sort of put innovation at the heart of the government's business development strategy at the time. From there, I made a move across from economic development into where I am now in the policy and cabinet part of the Chief Minister's Directorate, which was, for me, an opportunity to kind of learn a little bit more about how government works as a system, I suppose. And so I've been there for a few years now. I moved into social policy about 18 months ago. So I've been really enjoying this role, and I think the beauty of being in this social policy branch at the moment is that we get to look at the entirety of social policy that the ACT government works on. So it's a little bit removed from the front lines in some ways, which can be challenging at times. It's kind of being a mile wide, inch deep, but you do get to really see the full breadth of what's going on and how everything fits together and kind of impacts on other policies. So yeah, that's been my journey.
That's amazing. And you've covered so many portfolios, before coming into social policy, which is really incredible, because I guess pretty much everything impacts, social policy. So it's wonderful that you've got that breadth, I think. So how lucky for ACT government. So Andrew, tell me, what do you like doing in your spare time?
In my spare time, I'm a classic sort of Canberran. I like cycling quite a bit. And, Canberra is just fantastic for that. I do a little bit of road cycling and mountain biking as well, which is great sort of living in North Canberra. I've got, Bruce Ridge and Mount Majura and Mount Ainslie kind of just a couple of kilometres away after that, which is fantastic. Although I must admit I've been a little bit lazy over winter and since we've all been quarantining. So the kilos are starting to pack up, and I'll hopefully get out when the weather warms up a little bit. But other than that, I'm a bit of a homebody and just enjoy being home and watching movies and that kind of thing.
Love it. And that's, you are a very good Canberra citizen. That's right? So, and also it's good that you've been staying in. You've been being a
doing
role
my
model.
part, yeah.
Oh, that's incredible. Andrew, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the social issues in Canberra. Of course, every area has its own kind of its own trends and patterns that are driven by the particular characteristics of the people that are living there. So I was wondering if you could tell me, firstly maybe in a non-COVID setting, what are the usual key issues that face the Canberra population, and then maybe tell us a little bit about what things you're facing now that we're sort of in a new world and a lot has happened over the last few months.
Yeah, sure. So I think you mentioned Canberra's a little bit unique in some regards, but in others we do tend to have the same problems that you find elsewhere. The difference with Canberra is that they can often be a little bit more hidden than in other places. We've got a majority of the population which tends to be relatively kind of secure and stable and well catered for, but there are significant communities that need support or are experiencing vulnerability. And the challenge, I think, in Canberra, as different to some other places, is just how we actually find and reach those people. So, for example, the government's had a big policy around reducing recidivism in the justice space for some time, and has been exploring a number of different kind of policies looking to help people that have come into contact with the justice system to improve their outcomes. There's been a lot of work in the domestic and family violence space again to kind of explore what the issues are in a Canberra context, but also then how we can sort of explore different solutions that might work better for us. So I think a lot of the problems you see elsewhere, you see here, it's more just a case of how we can kind of deliver it in the context of a city-state that tends to be a little bit better on average. And in terms of the kind of post-COVID world, speak about that. I think the issue that we're seeing there, from my perspective anyway, is that we're not entirely sure what the issues are going to be at this stage. We can certainly sort of see some trends emerging, but the pandemic is obviously kind of far from being over at the moment, and in that context, it's hard to have a good grasp of what is changing, and particularly in on the time of the kind of frequency or time scale that we really need to be able to react to changes in the pandemic. And not only that, but we're seeing the kind of profile of vulnerability, I guess, change from what it has been in the past, where we'd have a relatively good understanding based on kind of, decades of history, which groups are going to be experiencing vulnerability or need support, and where we might be able to find them and engage with them and what they might need or what we might be able to provide. But we're seeing now, I think, with COVID through things like, massive and sudden increases in unemployment, social isolation, and the strain that puts on relationships, and a whole range of other things, that there's a range of people that in the past would never have considered themselves as needing support from, community services or government or anyone else necessarily, that are now in need of support, particularly mental health is kind of one of the key examples at the moment. And that's one that's just kind of across the board, whoever you are. I think even if you are still, gainfully employed and whatever else, I think the strain and the kind of general anxiety across the community is really testing people's mental health at the moment. And then along with that, there's the challenge we have of delivering those services in a kind of post-COVID or currently COVID world. Even if we can sort of identify what those needs are and who needs them, the traditional service models and programs that we've had are often heavily reliant on kind of being physically present with someone, either to identify that a need's there or then to be able to kind of deliver a service in person. And obviously we can do that to some extent, but when there's significant restrictions on physical movement throughout the community, that is much harder to do. So now we're kind of in the process of exploring, well, what are the new and different ways we can actually deliver things, whether it's telehealth by, Zoom meetings or whatever else the case may be. We're working through that. And then I guess the elephant in the room then is how we are going to pay for all of these services and changes going forward, because, obviously these services need to be provided, but at the same time, we're going to be seeing massive reductions in employment, and along with that, the revenues the governments are going to collect to be able to pay for those services. So, probably some consideration that's going to need to be given to how do we, possibly reorient the services or the kinds of things we're doing, not to, cut back, but to actually shift what we're doing from one way of thinking to a new way of thinking, so that we can kind of live within our means and not, exacerbate the kind of intergenerational pressures that we're going to see inevitably come from the pandemic.
Really challenging times. Lots of big things to solve, obviously, and and I thought that was interesting. The profile of vulnerability changing. I think it's sort of I guess, and I'm sure many other state governments would be facing this as well, that, all of a sudden what's been BAU for a long time is completely shifting. And while, that's very challenging, it will, I guess, lend itself to new ways of delivering social services in a sense. But we'll come back to that
Sure.
later. And of course, that's the whole theme of our conference, right? Social innovation. So we'll talk more about that. I think if you could tell us about sort of, how your work area is structured. What are the different things that your department does? And then maybe tell us a little bit about the process that you go through in terms of coming up with or developing social policy.
Yeah, sure. So like I sort of touched on before, the part of government that I'm in, the Chief Minister's Treasury and Economic Development Directorate, it's a real mouthful, but as a department we have, everything from the Cabinet Office, which kind of runs cabinet meetings for the government, right through to Access Canberra and things like sport and recreation services and shared services. So it's a really, really diverse directorate. The part that I'm in the Policy and Cabinet Division, we have a number of different kind of roles that we fill for the government, ranging from, as we talked about before, advising the Chief Minister on the range of social policy issues across government. But then we also kind of dip in and out of priorities as they emerge. So you tend to have kind of line agencies like a Community Services Directorate or a Justice and Safety Directorate that are responsible for the day-to-day of certain policy areas. And then if something pops up as a really priority issue or emerging pressure, we'll kind of dive in and try and help a little bit and then step back out. So in that way, it's a really interesting opportunity to kind of get a taste of everything, but it's a case of being kind of a mile wide and inch deep in most cases. But then we have in my team, for example, we have a number of kind of delivery functions. So the Office for LGBTIQ Affairs is part of the branch that I look after. We also do a lot of work on child safety and the implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations. For the reportable conduct scheme, for example, we look after the policy for that, as well as a big body of work at the moment on child safe standards for the territory, which is all about sort of not a compliance-based kind of regulatory scheme, but actually sort of supporting a child safe culture across our organisations that helps people understand what they need to do to be able to listen to and respond to the needs of children. So we have a lot of kind of delivery bits that we do there as well in other parts of the brand, in other parts of the division. There's a team that is doing the wellbeing indicators for the ACT government, which I'm sure a lot of people listening will be aware of. And things like intergovernmental relations and Cabinet Office and a bunch of other really interesting stuff. So we try and bring all of that together and provide kind of a bit of a joined up view of what's happening across government. And then one of the interesting bits, which is fairly new for me, but we've got a new little team that's set up to try and support policy capability development and evaluation capability across the ACT government. So it's a small team, but trying to just generally lift, I guess, the capability and the capacity to do good evaluations and good policy practice across directorates, linking in with things like the reforms that are happening in community engagement in another part of the directorate, as well as data and analytics, working closely with the Office of the Chief Digital Officer on those things to, I guess, just help people make sure they have the tools and the skills they need to do good policy development for the ACT.
That's really, really amazing. Your branch sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area and a great group of people as well. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Led by an amazing person, of course. I'm sure your team love working with you.
I don't know, we'll see.
And so tell us kind of, what's your what's an approach that you adopt in terms of, staying up to date with the issues and then formulating social policy, or basically what's the method that you take in terms of setting up kind of your work plan in a sense?
Yeah, I think it varies from project to project. I think the ACT government in particular is a pretty small jurisdiction and a relatively small government that's really connected with the community. So a lot of the way we work tends to be, very, very pragmatic and outcomes driven. So we don't have the kind of resources that other governments might have to do really big, thorough is not the right word, but, kind of big flagship policy processes. We tend to be very focused on just making sure we get an outcome for the community. So, what we try and do in our area is just have a bit of a watching brief across just various things that are happening in the community, whether that's being reported in the media or what we're hearing from kind of our personal networks or directorates, but just having a good understanding of what's starting to bubble up in different places. Sometimes the way we develop policy is, extremely rapid because there might be a really pressing issue, and COVID's been kind of case in point for that, where there, in a lot of cases, hasn't been the time that you would normally dedicate to developing a policy because, in many cases, people's livelihoods or lives are going to be impacted. But in other cases, I think what we try and encourage is moving a little bit away from what has traditionally been the policy cycle, which is, a very kind of waterfall method of developing policy where you go from one stage to the next stage to the next stage, and it's kind of engagement with the community is somewhere around here at the end when you've developed the other bits of the process. And for us, we're sort of trying to encourage a much more iterative approach to developing policy, where you can constantly kind of loop back if you need to, just check the problem, whether you've got that right, check whether the analysis you've done kind of adds up with an idea that you might have had. If new data comes to light, we should go back and have a look at that, and not go through a process where you kind of invest, 12 to 24 months in developing up a U-Butte kind of policy document that you then put all your eggs in that basket, and it may or may not work, but actually maybe try and stand something up that might be, 50% done, but it's enough to start testing whether it's actually going to work for the problem that you're trying to solve. I think that's the other key thing that we try and push people to look at is just, do we have the problem definition right? Because a lot of the time you'll have a really interesting idea or a solution, or you may be sort of rushing to implement something because the time is so tight or resources may be so constrained, but making sure that you've really understood that problem, including speaking to the people that it's impacting as much as you can. That's kind of the foundation that the rest of the process is built on. So if you don't kind of get that right from the outset, you end up designing a boat when what you needed was a bicycle. So yeah, that's the kind of work that we try and do, but as I say, it can be pretty fast moving at times, and we try and fit the process to those constraints, whether it's time or resources, and just try and make sure that we get the process matched to the scale of the problem.
I love that. And yeah, problem definition is such an important component, and I think it is kind of sometimes mind-boggling to see how many things that have kind of gone down a particular path, and then when you pause and go, well, what's the problem that you're actually trying to solve, and then there's a whole bunch of kind of circus happening trying to figure out actually what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And it sounds like sort of also you kind of have the like a human-centered design approach as well happening, so putting the people in the middle and then kind of iteratively testing your foundations.
There's a lot of work that's happened at different kind of levels across the ACT government in that space. So human-centered design is a kind of central feature now. A lot of the work that you see coming out of the Human Services Directorates in the ACT government. We've also done a bit of work around kind of participatory democracy type practices as well, which is a little bit of a larger scale. And again, we have had things like citizen juries in the ACT, but we've been, I guess, pretty straight about not saying that's the solution to every problem, every policy that we need to develop. And so we've had things from kind of full-blown citizen juries through to, I guess, more just participatory and design focused processes to develop things like the carers strategy, which the Community Services Directorate put out a while ago. And then you see things like the Family Safety Hub also in CSD, where they do a lot of work with their clients and organisations and community to kind of really design and explore solutions in partnership with the people that it impacts.
Really fascinating. Tell me a little bit more about the citizen juries and how it works, how it's worked for formulating the carer strategy and the safety hubs.
Look, I wasn't involved in the carer strategy, but I had a little bit to do with the citizen jury, and I was actually also a member of the panel for the one I can't remember the name of, but it was about kind of our city services. So I've seen it from both sides, and I think it's a really interesting approach. Again, it varies quite a bit from project to project, and it's a very bespoke way of kind of developing those processes. So in most of our cases, we've had outside help from Democracy Co, who are experts in that space and help develop the particular models that we use. But what I've found is those kind of participatory practices are really great at building trust in the solution that you come up with. So they do require a commitment from the government up front to kind of follow through. But there's kind of issues across the board, wherever you go in the world at the moment, that the levels of trust in government can be pretty low. And I've found that these processes are one way of mitigating some of those issues, because people actually get to take the time to talk with experts, whether they're from inside government or outside government, to understand the issues for themselves and then put forward their own thoughts. And they don't go straight into the solution. They get kind of workshopped with other people just like them that have the same access to information and same understanding that they do. And you get something at the end which is generally quite supported by the people that were involved, as well as the broader community, because they can see that it was kind of developed by a broad cross section of the community that looks like them as well. So that's kind of the bigger scale of that type of practice, but you can bring that down to a more focused kind of group that has your stakeholders and client group, rather than kind of like random sampling across the community and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's just a really great way of actually taking the time and creating the right kind of environment where people are actually able to engage with ideas and express their views and experiences, and kind of tell government what's important to them and what their perspectives are, without us trying, as a bureaucrat, sort of trying to guess what might be needed or what's going to work or not work. It's a way of respectfully kind of having a good dialogue about problems and solutions.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. I think that itself is a really innovative way of working. And then I guess I don't know, do you use the citizen juries also to then include them in the evaluation? So they've been a part of designing it, and then do they get to have a say on what they think in terms of how it's been rolled out or carried out?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got to that point yet, because we haven't sort of been doing that for so long. It's only been a few years in process, and obviously it's a little bit harder to do that at the moment with the pandemic. It's harder to bring people together and facilitate those kind of rich conversations. But part of those are absolutely looking at, what are we doing now, and do we think that it's delivering the outcomes we want, or are there ways we can improve? And then, once those solutions are put in place, then there's absolutely kind of more collaborative ways of doing evaluations than the traditional kind of commissioner report, and government commissions a report, goes off and gets some analysis back. It's actually engaging with the people that were impacted, and doing qualitative interviews with those people, getting the perspectives of other stakeholders and organisations as to whether they think something has worked, not just kind of the government view on we had this many client interactions, or a change in this kind of indicator over here, therefore we think it's worked.
Brilliant, very exciting. So I can actually talk to you forever. This is so fascinating. Also because I have a background in government, so I'm loving hearing everything that you're doing. So, but I realize that I need to move on to the next. So I wanted to. You talked about so many things that you've been a part of, that you've contributed to, that you've rolled out as well. But I was wondering if you can tell me, because obviously you've got your branch and you're kind of feeding into all the other sort of directorates as well. What from from the perspective of a Canberran, right? You're like myself, a typical Canberran who's very proud of their government, right? What are some of the key things that we should all be feeling really proud of from an ACT government perspective?
I think probably one of the most current ones is some of the work that's happening on the wellbeing indicators and wellbeing framework. I think that's just a really innovative in a sense. I mean, New Zealand has kind of done something similar, and we work closely with them and try and draw on what they're doing, but not many other places have really gone to the point of having a fully grounded wellbeing framework and set of indicators that actually measure and can tell us, what is changing in our community and how is well-being, as a kind of holistic concept, going up or down across, a range of different domains and measures as well. So that's still, in the fairly early stages of that work. I mean, it's a long-term kind of reform, both the government and the community to understand that, but it does really extend our thinking about the community beyond the traditional stuff that we can measure and easily report on, which are the economic indicators like, unemployment and GDP, which are absolutely important, but they don't necessarily tell you whether you feel like you have enough time with your family, or whether you get to kind of connect with nature enough, or, whether your mental health has been going up or down and that kind of thing. So that's not, I've been only involved very peripherally with that, but it's been a huge bit of work for the other team that's in the directorate, who've, really done a huge amount of work to sort of engage with different groups across the community to, really make sure it is a thorough kind of representation of what wellbeing means for Canberrans specifically, and not just kind of an adoption of, something that the OECD has kind of put out at a, global level. So I think that's a really big achievement. I do also think the work that the directorate and the government has been doing around community engagement is something that I have looked at quite positively. I know it doesn't necessarily always feel like you're being engaged from the individual citizen perspective, but seeing the amount of work that's kind of gone into things like those participatory democracy measures and the also community panel that they've put out to really kind of get representative views on a really frequent scale across the community, and the work they've put into just making sure that we keep the community informed about what government is doing and what it's hearing from the community as well is something that I've found quite important. And then, from my perspective, we're doing a lot of work in the Office for LGBTIQ space, for example. So there's some legislation that will be probably debated later today, to prohibit conversion practices, sexuality and gender identity conversion practices. So, that's an area where the ACT government is really kind of stepped out ahead of a number of the other jurisdictions, and we did that earlier this year as well with some reforms to reduce the penalties associated with people possessing small amounts of cannabis, which again is not to kind of minimise the harm that drugs do, but to say that there are other ways of dealing with that issue, which can, from our perspective, is a health problem, rather than bringing them into the criminal justice system, which is probably likely to send them down a very troubling path in terms of their future social outcomes. So, those are two things that I've been involved in to different extents this year, and last year, which I think are kind of good reflections of the way the ACT government can move on social issues in a way that not all governments can necessarily do.
Absolutely. No, really, really brilliant. Really amazing things. So thank you for sharing those. Okay, so our next question is a big one, right? So, I mean, and it's a good lead up, because you've been sort of talking about all the great things that are happening, and not just the things that are happening, but also the processes to sort of getting there, which themselves make a really big difference. So we're in this setting where we're talking earlier. We're in this kind of situation where the whole world is kind of gone upside down. Yeah. Nobody would have, I think, predicted the situation that we're in at the moment, and also the uncertainty of it going forward, right? So what is the future? What does the future of social innovation look like in Canberra, in a sort of, as we approach this post-COVID-19 world? And hopefully we are getting closer and closer to getting to a position where we get through the pandemic, although I'm sure it's far from, sort of being over. But I was watching a webinar by Professor Muhammad Yunus the other night, where he was sort of saying that, the one thing we shouldn't do is we shouldn't go backwards, right? So this is, one of the big opportunities is for us to build, more of the world that we want to live in. And so you've talked about so many amazing things that Canberra is doing around, the well-being indicators, involving people in the decision-making process to kind of public policy. But I'm just kind of wondering, given the particular issues that we now need to solve, you talked about mental health and the different way of thinking about service delivery. You also talked about the resource constraints and how we may need to sort of shift. What does the future look like to you in terms of applying innovation, which we kind of have to do now? Innovation is a necessity. What does that look like for you in the next 12 months or the next 24 months?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a little bit hard to say, right? But I think in terms of what we go back to, whether it's a new normal or something like that. One of the comments that was made to me a few months ago was, the kind of isolation and challenges that we've all been feeling over the last 6 or so months are things that are there every day for a lot of people, particularly people with disability. And the point was, we don't want to go back to pre-COVID. We don't want to go back to the old normal. We actually have an opportunity now where people have kind of experienced what it's like to live with that kind of isolation and removal from social networks and services, and we have an opportunity now to build something better and more suitable and inclusive. So when natural disasters like a bushfire happens, we talk about building back better and not just kind of building the same bridge that burnt down, but building it back in a way that it's not going to burn down next time, kind of thing. So this has been, I think, will be an opportunity for us to really look across the board and have a think about whether the way we've been doing things in the past, a lot of which we've had to kind of stop because it hasn't been possible in a pandemic. And, whether we bring those things back or whether we actually have an opportunity now to think of something entirely new and more suitable for 2021 and beyond. And a lot of that is going to come down to the issues that we spoke about earlier, where the actual needs of the community are going to look different, I think, post-COVID to pre-COVID, and the way we're going to need to deliver those services, even once the pandemic's over. I think there's probably going to be some kind of permanent impacts on the way we gather socially and kind of conduct our business and that kind of thing, that are going to pick up a lot of the good things that have come out of the pandemic in terms of resilience and the way people have been able to start doing new work and connecting with each other and that kind of stuff. And I think that, combined with the issue of how we're going to pay for all that, is kind of putting social innovation now at the forefront, because we really need to look at how are we going to do all this stuff when the old ways, they might still be suitable in some cases, but in a lot of cases, they're not going to be as effective or efficient as they have been in the past. So the role of social innovation now has really come to the fore with, really opportunities for grassroots-led kind of social innovation, where people can identify the urgent, immediate needs in their communities and kind of quickly do something to respond to that. It doesn't have to be kind of a big enterprise. It might just be a little support network that you can create in your neighborhood and bear hunts and that kind of thing to help just get kids a little bit more engaged and outdoors if they're going a bit stir crazy, things like that. But on a kind of larger community scale, and I think that kind of grassroots-led model is going to be really important for identifying what the actual needs are in a quick and rapid way, but also identifying what is going to work, and be able to kind of test that, because we're all now looking at not just what's happening in Canberra, but everyone's looking at what's happening in Melbourne and Sydney and Turkey and Norway, and just trying to understand, really vacuum up kind of all these ideas and just see what's working and what we might be able to apply here in our backyard, and share that as well with, again, the people in Victoria and Sydney and other places, because we're all kind of in this together. And I think just that kind of opportunity to share those ideas, and then have almost an authorizing environment to kind of try those things in a way that we might not have been able to in the past, when there was kind of systems and policies in place for 10 years, and they changed, but they changed slowly. Now we've hit the pause button on some of that stuff just because we've had to, which means now there's kind of a bit more space, I guess, to try those new ideas and see what's going to work and what's not going to work as well.
It's in the worst possible time, this is everything you said is really exciting, right? It's an exciting time for social policy.
A little bit of silver lining, maybe.
A little bit of silver lining, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But you termed it really nicely. I think one sort of final question is, I loved that you talked about the grassroots led kind of approach. So for one of the things that we've been sort of asking all our guests is, for the everyday person or a community organization or anyone from the private sector, what's a great way to be in touch with yourself, your area, or ACT government in general, to maybe share any ideas that they might have on any of these grassroots-led innovations, ideas, social change themes?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's a range of ways. Obviously, anytime we're sort of doing a formal consultation, it's always good to look at yoursay.act.gov.au, and that can be one way. It's not for everyone, obviously. I'd also encourage people to sign up for the Your Say community panel, which is where there'll be kind of engagements coming out every every couple of weeks. But otherwise, if you stay in touch with particularly organisations or groups that you're involved with or interested with, often they'll have an existing relationship with directorates. But otherwise, we're all pretty approachable, and the Nation government has a no-law kind of approach. So even if you've got an idea and you're not sure like who you need to speak to or whether it's going to fly, you can always just call up Access Canberra and they'll be able to put you through to an area, and they might not be able to get back to you straight away, but they'll put you through to someone who'll be able to talk to you and maybe give you a little bit of advice or information about what the government's already doing, or who you could speak to about taking an idea and testing it out or seeing if it's going to work. So I think it's just good to remember that pretty much everyone in the ACB government is a member of this community, so we're all kind of invested personally, we're all around and accessible. But if you're not sure who to contact, the Access Canberra line is always great, but we have all these kind of informal networks as well, so someone approaches you and you need to pass on an idea to me, or I can make sure it gets to the right person in government as well. So I think just work through your networks, and eventually in Canberra it's so connected that it gets to the place that it needs to go to sooner or later.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, talking to you. Is there anything that you wanted to share or add before we say goodbye to our viewers for today?
No, just thank you to you, Nazia, and to everyone who's been watching. It's been great to talk about this stuff with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrew. Take care, and we will speak again soon. And thank you to our viewers. And we have another session, the final session this afternoon with Professor Israr Qureshi, where we talk about the vision for a post-COVID-19 world. Take care, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Nazia. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrew. Bye.